All right, let's go. Number 10. Reino Häyhänen, the illegal who couldn't hold it together. In 1952, the KGB inserted an officer named Reino Häyhänen into the United States under a false Finnish-American identity. He carried a forged American passport, a fabricated personal history, and instructions to establish himself as a civilian and support Soviet intelligence operations in New York. He was supposed to be invisible. Instead, he drank. He neglected his assignments. He mishandled funds. He failed to make scheduled dead drop exchanges. He was recalled to Moscow in 1957, and rather than board the ship, he walked into the American embassy in Paris and defected. The information he provided led directly to the arrest of Rudolf Abel, one of the most senior Soviet illegal officers ever caught on American soil. But Häyhänen himself is the more instructive case. He had lived in the United States for 5 years, built a cover identity, maintained a residence, and operated inside American society without being detected, not because his tradecraft was excellent, but because no one was looking. His exposure came entirely from his own defection. The KGB's illegal program did not depend on brilliant operatives. It depended on the baseline invisibility of ordinary life.
Number 9. Rudolf Abel. For 9 years, a man named Emil Goldfuss lived in Brooklyn, rented a studio, painted, played guitar, and was known to his neighbors as a quiet, cultivated, retired businessman. His name was not Emil Goldfuss. It was William Fischer. He was a KGB colonel and one of the most skilled illegal intelligence officers the Soviet Union ever deployed to the United States. His mission was to coordinate Soviet intelligence operations in North America and manage a network of agents passing information to Moscow. Fischer was identified only after Häyhänen's defection provided enough detail to locate him. FBI agents arrested him in his hotel room in 1957. During his trial, he refused to confirm his real name. He was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 45 years. He was exchanged for American U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers in 1962 on the Glückliche Bridge in Berlin, the first spy swap of the Cold War. Fischer had operated in New York for 9 years. His neighbors attended his arrest with visible disbelief. He had been the most unremarkable person on the block.
Number 8. Morris and Lona Cohen. Morris and Lona Cohen were a married couple from New York. Morris had fought in the Spanish Civil War. Lona was a school teacher. They were, by the account of everyone who knew them, entirely ordinary people with left-leaning politics and no unusual characteristics. They were also the couriers who carried the technical specifications for the first Soviet atomic bomb out of Los Alamos. The Cohens had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the late 1930s. By the early 1940s, they were running a courier network that moved intelligence between scientists inside the Manhattan Project and their Soviet handlers. Lona Cohen personally collected a package of documents from physicist Ted Hall at a New Mexico train station and transported them to New York inside a Kleenex box. When American counterintelligence began closing in on the Soviet atomic spy network in the early 1950s, the Cohens vanished. They resurfaced in England in 1954 under the names Peter and Helen Kroger, operating a rare books business in a suburb of London. They were arrested in 1961 as part of the Portland spy ring. They had been operational for 20 years across 2 countries under 2 identities.
Number 7. George Koval. George Koval was born in Iowa. He grew up speaking English without an accent. He attended American schools and understood American culture from the inside because he had grown up inside it. His family moved to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, where he was recruited by Soviet military intelligence. He was then inserted back into the United States as an illegal, a man who looked, sounded, and behaved like an American because he had been one. He was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1943 and assigned, due to his scientific background, to the Manhattan Project. He worked at the Oak Ridge facility in Tennessee and later at the Dayton Project in Ohio, both of which handled plutonium and polonium production for the atomic bomb program. He had access to the detailed technical specifications of American nuclear weapons production. He was never detected. He left the United States in 1948 and returned to the Soviet Union. He died in Moscow in 2006. Russian President Vladimir Putin posthumously awarded him the title Hero of the Russian Federation in 2007, at which point American intelligence officials publicly acknowledged for the first time that they had not known about him during his operational years. He had been inside American nuclear weapons production. He was identified 60 years later by a posthumous decoration.
Number 6. Jack Barsky. In 1978, a man named Jack Barsky arrived in the United States on a forged American passport. He had been trained by the KGB at a facility outside Moscow, given an identity based on a deceased American child, and inserted into New York City with instructions to build a cover life and eventually penetrate American political or intelligence institutions. He learned to ride the subway, he got a job, he enrolled in evening classes and eventually earned a degree. He married, he had children. For 10 years he lived as an American, maintaining contact with his Soviet handlers through dead drops and coded shortwave radio transmissions. In 1988, the KGB sent him a message telling him to return to Moscow, the implication being that he had been identified. He sent back a message saying he had AIDS and could not travel. This was a lie. He simply did not want to go back. He stayed. He built a career in information technology. He was identified by the FBI in 1993, placed under surveillance for 3 years, and eventually approached by agents in 1997. He cooperated fully. He was not prosecuted. He became an American citizen. He later gave interviews, wrote a memoir, and spoke publicly about his years as a Soviet illegal. He described his time in America as the period when he stopped being a Soviet officer and became, without fully intending to, the person his cover identity said he was.
Number 5. Conan Molody, Gordon Lonsdale. In the mid-1950s, a man named Gordon Lonsdale arrived in England. He had a Canadian passport, a plausible background story, and a business selling jukeboxes and bubblegum machines. He was sociable, commercially successful, and well-liked. He dated women, attended parties, and was a recognizable presence in London social circles. He was also running the Portland Spy Ring, a KGB network that had penetrated the British Admiralty underwater weapons establishment at Portland and was passing classified naval intelligence, including information about British submarine technology and anti-submarine warfare programs, to Moscow. His real name was Conan Molody. He was a KGB illegal who had spent years building the Gordon Lonsdale identity, specifically for British deployment. His network included Morris and Lona Cohen, operating nearby as the Krogers, who handled the radio transmission equipment. He was arrested in 1961. At trial, he maintained his Gordon Lonsdale identity throughout. He was exchanged for British businessman Greville Wynne in 1964. After returning to the Soviet Union, he wrote a memoir that was published under the Gordon Lonsdale name, a memoir about his life as Gordon Lonsdale, written by a man who was not Gordon Lonsdale.
Number 4. Andrey Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova.
For 20 years, a couple lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, raised 2 children in the American school system, maintained a social life, paid taxes, attended neighborhood events, and were regarded by everyone who knew them as a perfectly ordinary Canadian-American family. Their names to their neighbors were Donald Heathfield and Anne Foley. Their real names were Andrey Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova. They were SVR officers, successors to the KGB, deployed to the United States as deep cover illegals with instructions to build lives, establish contacts, and eventually develop access to American policy and intelligence circles. They were arrested in 2010 as part of a coordinated FBI operation that dismantled a network of 10 SVR illegals operating across the United States simultaneously. Their 2 sons, who had been raised as Americans, educated as Americans, and had no knowledge of their parents' actual identities, learned who their parents were when the arrests became public. The elder son, Timothy, gave an interview in which he described learning his entire childhood had been constructed around a cover story. His parents were deported to Russia in a spy swap. He remained in the United States.
Number 3. Mikhail Vasenkov, Juan Lazaro. For 30 years, a man named Juan Lazaro lived in New York City. He had a Uruguayan passport, a career as a photographer and academic, a published book of photography, and a wife named Vicky Pelez, who was a journalist at a Spanish-language newspaper. He was among the 10 SVR illegals arrested in 2010. His real name was Mikhail Vasenkov. He had been operating continuously in the United States since the 1970s, longer than any other illegal identified in the operation. His cover had held through the entirety of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and 16 years of post-Soviet Russian intelligence operations. His wife, Vicky Pelez, was charged as a co-conspirator. She had written columns critical of American foreign policy, which her handlers had encouraged. She maintained that she had not fully understood the nature of her husband's activities. Vasenkov was deported to Russia. Pelez was given the option to remain in the United States or be deported with her husband. She chose deportation. 30 years of constructed life in New York, and the person who had been built around the cover chose the man behind it over the country the cover had been built in.
Number 2. Ludmila and her network, the radio operators. The SVR illegal program was not only composed of agents whose job was to collect intelligence directly. A significant component of the program consisted of communications officers, illegals whose primary function was to maintain the radio and digital infrastructure through which other illegals communicated with Moscow. Among the 10 arrested in 2010 was a woman operating under a false identity in New Jersey whose primary role had been to receive and transmit encrypted messages. She had no direct contact with intelligence targets. Her job was the signal. The existence of a dedicated communications infrastructure for the illegal program reveals its organizational scale. An organization with enough operational illegals in the field to require dedicated communications officers operating simultaneously across multiple cities is not an improvised effort. It is a sustained organizational commitment with a budget, a personnel pipeline, a training infrastructure, and a long-term strategic intention. The 2010 arrests exposed 10 people. The FBI's assessment, made public in court documents, was that these 10 were not the entirety of the program. They were the ones that had been identified.
Number 1. The program itself. The cases on this list span from the 1940s to 2010. They include a man from Iowa who entered the Manhattan Project, a Brooklyn painter who was a KGB colonel, a couple who raised American children for 20 years, and a photographer who maintained his cover through the entire Cold War and 16 years beyond it. They were identified through defections, through communications intercepts, through investigative work that in several cases took decades, and in Koval's case, not at all during his operational lifetime. But here is what the cumulative record of the Soviet and Russian illegal program reveals that no individual case conveys on its own. The program was never fully mapped. Every counterintelligence assessment produced after a successful arrest or defection acknowledged the same limitation. The people who had been identified were a fraction of those who had been deployed. The program operated on the assumption that the majority of its illegals would never be found, that the investment in building cover identities deep enough to survive decades of ordinary life was justified precisely because most of them would simply remain invisible. The ones on this list were the failures, not because their operations failed, but because they were eventually found. The ones who were never found are not on any list. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.